Thank you so much for coming to this last public presentation of our Visiting Practitioner series for this semester. And for those of you who are frequent flyers, thank you so much for all your attendance all through the semester. We will have a full lineup next semester as well. But for this semester, for the fall semester, we are so happy to close out the series with our great friend and good buddy, Debbie Stothard, who we've been working with at GMAP for many years now, and who we just continue to admire more and more and more for her gravity and seriousness, her sense of of decorum and appropriateness, and her fantastic courage, which you'll be hearing a big time tonight. Debbie's the founder and organizer, the founder and director of ALTSEAN-Burma, which is a human rights organization that has been advocating for democracy and minority rights in Burma and Myanmar since 1996.
Actually, since '88, but I formed the organization in '96.
It's a fantastic NGO, which Debbie's baby, made from nothing, is now one of the major players in the global network of resistance to military activity. During her 32-year career, Debbie has worked as a journalist, as a community education consultant, a government advisor and trainer in her native Malaysia, and Australia and Thailand. Her work is focused on innovative and empowering advocacy and capacity building strategies for marginalized groups, in particular women and men. In 2013, Debbie was elected as the Secretary General of the International Federation for Human Rights. We're so happy that you've been spending the week with us visiting classes, even though that you were getting over being sick, you didn't seem to care. You just did it anyway. I think you were in 5 or 6 classes close to the GMAP record for visiting practitioner. We're just so grateful to you for being here. And I get to read out the title of your lecture, which I was just
Yes.
all day.
Yes.
The title of the lecture is A Youth-Led Movement to Walk, Chew Gum, and Chant at the Same Time, but Can the Rest of the World Do the Same? An update on Burma. Please join me in welcoming Debbie.
Thank you, everybody, for coming in on basically your last week when all of you are crazily trying to finish your assignments. I thought I'd kick off the session today with a 3.5-minute video. So please watch it, pay attention, and then I'll do a follow-up afterwards. Okay, thanks for playing that. I'm just going to throw some statistics at you. The coup started on February 1st, 2021, when the newly elected parliament was due to be sworn in. The National League for Democracy and other ethnic parties had won the majority of the seats. The military, who already had significant political power under the 2008 constitution, was not satisfied with losing again. And so Min Aung Hlaing, the senior general, who was due to retire in 2021, sought to extend his power by pressuring Aung San Suu Kyi, the head of the NLD, to appoint him president. He took a leaf out of Trump's playbook and started a campaign to accuse the NLD of electoral fraud, to try and pressure the winning party to make him president. That didn't work out, and so he launched the coup. When he launched the coup, he basically told the world and the rest of Burma, people of Burma, that everything would be under control by the Water Festival. Water Festival, or Buddhist New Year, happens in mid-April. He did not count on the fact that young people around Burma were going to say, screw you, we're not going to accept this coup. And you can see from this video that in the majority of the shots you saw, it was mainly young people. Young people who during the transition period of 2011 to 2021 had grown up in a situation of slightly more freedom and greater access to the world through access to the internet and communications. They could not, they refused to accept that their limited freedoms could be taken away from them just like that. Now, 2 years after the coup, here's some statistics. Oh, there's a little bit of a formatting issue. This is what happens when you go from one type of computer to the Apple system. Before the coup, in the year before the coup, there were 1,140 armed clashes and attacks on civilians. These were mainly happening in the state of Kachin in the north and the state of Arakan or Rakhine in the west. So that you will know from this that there have been ongoing smaller, low-intensity conflicts in the country. In the first year of the coup, this jumped to 9,356 incidents, and in the second year of the coup, 10,559. The reason the junta started to become extremely violent was that they could not handle the resistance. They were extremely panicky. They became increasingly brutal because, hi David, would you like some drugs? So they became increasingly brutal, and that brutality was not just confined to rural ethnic minority or ethnic nationality communities. It started to turn in on urban, mainly majority Burman young people because they kept resisting the coup. If we were to count the latest figures from the 1st of February 2021 to the 31st of March 2023, there were at least 21,531 armed clashes and attacks on civilians, and the junta had arrested 21,279 people, mostly young people, and sentenced at least 150 of them to death. Several have been executed. Some people have died during interrogation or in custody, in jail, because prison conditions are extremely harsh, but even more scary is the interrogation center, where interrogation equals very intense forms of torture. Next. So here are some other statistics, but what we saw is a move in terms of brutality, new strategies which had actually been used against the Rohingya during the genocidal violence of 2016-2017. The military started burning people alive. This is what they did to Rohingya, and now they started to do it to people around the country. The most notorious case was the Christmas Eve massacre of Pruso in Karenni or Kayah state. At that time, nearly 40 people displaced by war and by violence, men, women, and children, were traveling to another village to seek shelter and celebrate Christmas with their loved ones. They were intercepted by the military junta troops and captured and burnt alive. The military originally said, yes, it happened and these were all terrorists. But when the evidence came out that there were aid workers in their mix, there were women and children definitely unarmed, then they said, no, it wasn't as it was the other side. But prior to the Christmas Eve massacre of 2021, we actually saw cases like that happening, small groups of people being burnt alive in other parts of the country. And now, what we've also seen is the use to terrorize local population, beheading people, and to further terrorize the population. So they're really upping the ante. But one of the most important things to recognize is that the PDFs, the People's Defense Forces, and the ethnic resistance organizations have gotten better at ambushing troops on the ground. And so the military is now relying very much on airstrikes. And the airstrikes definitely target civilians. And I'll show you later with some data. Now, this is why the movement keeps calling for aviation fuel sanctions, to cut the flow of aviation fuel to the junta, to the country, because any aviation fuel that goes in the country can be commanded by the junta, and therefore this, in order to stop the airstrikes from happening. Some of you may be aware, 2 weeks ago in Paziji, in Sagaing, in the west part of the country, about 170 people, including women and children, were killed at a gathering by an airstrike. Previously, in Kachin State in the north, a music festival was targeted by an airstrike. And in Sagaing, in a school, attack helicopters were used to bombard the school and kill the children as they ran away from the school. So I'm sorry I hope I don't trigger you with this information. It's very painful information, especially for people from Burma, regardless of whether they're in the country or outside the country, that these things are happening routinely. And it's a great sense of frustration and outrage that civilian protection does not seem to be a priority of the international community. People kept calling for, try to invoke responsibility to protect, they try to invoke all kinds of justifications and say, come protect us, but that couldn't happen. And this is why many young people who were involved in a peaceful protest started to join the People's Defense Forces, because they felt that since they're not going to be defended and protected by the international community, they will have to take up arms to protect themselves and the communities. Now, at this point, only the UK and Canada have adopted aviation fuel sanctions. The US has been good with certain targeted sanctions, but when it comes to oil and fuel, there's this blinkers, they're allergic to anything, sanctioning anything that involves oil and fuel. And that includes the Myanmar Oil and Gas Enterprise, which is one of the largest sources of revenue for the junta. So we've got to work on that. You're here, I hope that you do something about it. Next. Now here's some data data from the past 6 months, contrasting what was happening with Burma and what was happening in Ukraine. So in the past 6 months, there's been 280 incidents of reported airstrikes. These are for airstrikes from November 2022 to April 2023. And that compares to Ukraine, where there were 532 documented airstrikes. But 237 people, civilians, were killed in these airstrikes in Burma, Myanmar, compared to 82 civilians killed in Ukraine. We could see that the percentage of civilian deaths, basically the percentage of civilians who were killed by airstrike in Burma, Myanmar is 57.8 compared to 4.51. So we could see very clearly from this data that civilians were not collateral damage, they were the target. This is consistent with the military's ongoing strategy of targeting civilians, including women and children, with all forms of violence in order to cut local support for the resistance and to also distract and demoralize the resistance. This is part of a very long-standing strategy. Next. Oh, by the way, all that data comes from ACLAD, the Armed Conflict Location Event Database. And if you ever want to look at conflicts around the world, they have a really good dashboard and a system with the database that you can use. So if you're ever looking at atrocity crimes and trying to look at different types of crimes that are happening around the world, please use ACLAD. Now, obviously, all those atrocity crimes and violence has an economic impact. And we could see basically the economy shrank. UN says that 34% of the population will need urgent humanitarian assistance compared to 1 million in 2021. 17.6 million, 34%. So roughly, if this is Burma, roughly all this side of the room would need urgent humanitarian assistance. The poverty had doubled to 40%, and then these are figures that were earlier this year. It could be worse, we could check again. And inflation had gone up, but also, one of the interesting things when you actually doing human rights work is looking at data to get a kind of a picture, and sometimes it's useful to compare it to a situation which has public attention. The Myanmar Chart at the end of last year lost 60% of its value compared to the Ukrainian hryvnia, which lost 30% of its value. And Ukraine was being invaded by a massive, well-armed military. So it's telling us that this lawlessness is really affecting people's basic right to food and shelter. Next. So what were young people doing? Well, they were at the forefront of the protest movement as soon as the coup happened. And this is a famous photo up here because Mam became a protest leader. Before that, she was an activist who publicly stood in solidarity with the Rohingya and condemned the genocide of the Rohingya, and she was ridiculed and vilified and even threatened for doing that in public. But after the coup happened and she became one of the leading faces and voices of the protest movement, her position and the position of other young people started to resonate in the political movement. And what that meant is that we saw a rare occurrence where young Burmese people were publicly apologizing to the Rohingya for denying the genocide and called for the inclusion of Rohingya. And this is like a massive turnaround in terms of the prevailing propaganda and Islamophobia that the Rohingya community was subjected to. So this is something where there's a lot of horrifying violence, a lot of tragedy, a lot of brutality, but amidst this, that certain things started to change in the political movement, thanks to the rise of young voices in the national politics. And so if you go online, you'll see amazing videos of large numbers of young people not just in the main city of Rangoon and Mandalay, but also in smaller towns and villages, including in areas that were under the control of ethnic resistance organizations. But you can see that someone didn't lose their sense of humor. um, my ex is bad, but my village was worse. So people actually didn't lose their emotional resilience. They actually was still very strong and still very determined in their resistance. Next, and you saw people dancing during the protest. But when the military started killing people, then the movement had to resort to flash mobs, but also silent strikes. So if anyone has been to Rangoon, this is the Sule Pagoda Junction downtown, and that's one of the busiest parts of Rangoon. It's quite full all the time. And in this case, people agreed to follow the silent strike and they didn't come out on the streets to show this is a reverse strike. Like instead of coming out on the streets and being subjected to violence, they said, okay, everyone stay at home. And then the junta in retaliation tried to gather people on the streets to make noise. And it was a little bit pathetic, so it even made people more justified. Okay, next. Now, we talked about, in the video you saw that medics and young people also, existing medics, but young people trying to go online to learn how to treat gunshot wounds and skill up themselves in terms of being able to provide medical assistance to their community. And so this is something that was happening, but also they started to build alternative schools. The CDM teachers, the Civil Disobedience Movement teachers, ran schools in areas that were under control of the resistance. They actually took over the local school and taught their own curriculum. But many young people were concerned about access to tertiary education. So they started to build all kinds of online universities. And one of the most famous ones is the Spring University in Myanmar. And this is because the resistance, the revolution, we call it revolution, the uprising that began in February 2021 is often referred to as the Spring Revolution. And we can also see that there's a Federal Health Myanmar online learning. And this is actually to help people improve their public health capacity. And you can see what the tagline is, providing interim education for medical fellows during the revolution era. So in addition to resisting and fighting for survival, people are actually continually trying to rebuild and address all the gaps and all the needs of the community, even during what is essentially a civil war. Next. Young people have also been at the forefront of protest art, protest music. So the last, towards the end of the video, you heard people singing Burmese language, one of the revolutionary songs. But if you go to Three Fingers for Myanmar, so Three Fingers is the protest symbol, you will see many examples of both artists from the country and also allies from all around the world expressing themselves through protest art. And this is quite interesting because this is a generation of activists that are talking about mental health and caring for each other. Previous generations were like, we're all tough, we're going to fight the military, do or die. But here we're actually seeing a generation that's thinking forward. How are we going to rebuild our community, our country, but also ourselves? And this is something that I'm extremely optimistic about, because this is a revolution that also has care for each other. Next. There are quite a huge number of youth-led organizations that continue to do all kinds of work, whether it's humanitarian assistance and relief work, whether it's human rights advocacy and documentation, whether it's engaging in in policy development and legislative change discussions. And here are some examples. We have the Women's League of Burma, who has been active, who's an umbrella of 13 different ethnic-based women's organizations who have been active since 1999. And they really had to work. When the coup happened, they were ready on the ground to deal with the challenges that followed. The general strike committees that were organizing the protests at local level ended up forming the general strike committees of nationalities, a multi-ethnic network, a multi-ethnic organization that may be led by young people, and trying to find ways and means of how to continue expressing their resistance safely without actually going on the streets. And of course, we have Women's Peace Network, which has been on the scene since 2012 and had been addressing and fighting impunity since it was formed. And so it's a Rohingya youth-led organization, women-led organization, and the founder is in the room. Next. So the National Unity Government was formed by the elected MPs who were not allowed to go into parliament because of the coup. And you could see in the cabinet, we saw a greater diversity of cabinet that the country has ever had in its history, including an out gay man serving as the Human Rights Minister. But in this mix, we also see that there are two young people. Ethan Zamang is the Deputy Minister for the Ministry of Women, Youth and Children's Affairs, and it was her photo in that protest photo. She was an activist photo. And Jatoy Pan, Kachin youth activist and politician, is the Deputy Minister for Education. So next. And also, we have the National Unity Government, which is basically the cabinet, but the main political power behind that is the National Unity Consultative Council, which is a huge and very diverse group in which young people have quite an important role to play. This is the policy development, legislative discussion, transitional justice arrangements, all of those are being debated and developed at the National Unity Consultative Council, the NUCC. And so before the session started, Max was marveling or horrified to learn that there are such things as 5-hour Zoom meetings. Well, these 5-hour Zoom meetings are basically NUCC members connecting across different time zones and from inside the country to talk about these issues and come to some agreements. Next. Now, young people, besides caring for each other, engaging in health and education activities, continuing the protests in whatever shape, size, or form, also join the armed struggle. And that is mainly because the international community and neighboring countries could not offer any civilian protection. So I think I copied this out of the Reuters special report, but it really shows how young people have transformed themselves in response to the coup. From a young woman doing her model shot, looking very glamorous, to still looking pretty glamorous, but in her jungle fatigues. A lot of people have joined the armed struggle because they have been accused of supporting the armed struggle, even when they didn't, so they just thought, well, we're going to join. And this is something that's quite significant because last year, a young woman in Sagaing, in the northwest of the country, and another young woman in Tanitai region, which is in the southeast of the country, the opposing side of the country, both of them were sentenced to 7 years jail for donating about $2 to humanitarian efforts. They were accused of, well, the one in Sagaing donated about $2 and the one in Tanitai donated about $7. But they went to jail for that amount of time because they were accused of donating money to the People's Defense Force, and when they actually say they were actually donating to humanitarian efforts. Next. Oh yeah. Okay. One of the interesting things that happened, I'm sorry I didn't put in a photo of this, is the Tamang Revolution. Tamang is a woman's sarong. What's worn? A woman's wraparound skirt. Now, in traditional Burman Buddhist culture, what a woman wears below her waist is considered spiritually unclean. So you have to, when you have, some homes even had 2 washing machines. One is for the women's stuff and one is for the guy stuff, so the guy stuff doesn't get spiritually polluted for middle class families. But also, when you did your laundry, most women would have to hang the tamangs under the house, somewhere where men are not likely to pass, out of fear that their spiritual aura will be tainted by touching a woman's skirt. So what happened during the coup, when the coup started, was the women started stringing up their tamangs across the streets. Okay, and then when the police and the military trucks came into that area, they would stop because they didn't want to drive under the women's tamangs, and so they would get the most junior person. They go and pull that down, and then we can pass. And that was really a good way of protecting the local community because then they had time to run away. And gradually, men also abandoned that taboo and started waving flags made of women's tamang, and to show, to basically as a form of defiance. And that's kind of a very interesting change in terms of how these social taboos have been broken down in some communities and among some groups. So this is something that makes me optimistic. But hopefully it's a change that continues and doesn't just halt there. But you can see here there's the women who decided when they saw their sisters being raped and killed, that they didn't want to be the next victim, they wanted to resist. And so there's actually the Myung Women's Guerrilla Group, which is an example of an all-women resistance team. And even very glamorous women and former actresses are joining the armed struggle, looking, well, yeah. And also women joining the resistance as medics to help local communities and fighters who've been injured. So we can see all of them young women. Next. Is that it? Okay. So what is the what are the demands? There are many, many demands. But one of the things that we still need urgently is civilian protection. What does that mean? That might mean ensuring that there are safe corridors on the border areas where the military cannot bomb, cannot launch artillery attacks or airstrikes. So that requires a greater presence on the other side of the border to be able to help those IDPs. Refugees who arrive in places like India, China, Bangladesh, Thailand, even Malaysia and Indonesia should be given protection and shelter instead of trying to be criminalized or to be forced back into the country. There's also the question of not supporting the junta. The junta is illegal even under the law of the country. And people have been saying, oh well, it's de facto in charge. Well, unfortunately, you're not looking at the figures because this illegal junta does not have control of the majority of the territory. They do not have de jure claim and they do not have de facto claim. We're seeing some governments and some international organizations being sloppy and saying, well, they still have Yangon and they still have Naypyidaw, the main city, so we'll just work with them, which is basically making them conspirators or collaborators with war criminals. So this is something that is quite of concern. The other thing too is that groups on the border, many community groups are actually doing humanitarian assistance in war zones and in situations which are considered extremely dangerous, where international organizations cannot go. And donors need to fund them to be able to continue their work. One of my alumni from my women's program, a 24-year-old recent graduate, is actually running an internally displaced persons camp for 400 teenagers near the Thai border. When the war started, her state, Karenni state, was subjected to the highest number of, the highest amount of military violence per capita. We did actually a study and found that they actually received, they were actually disproportionately vulnerable to violence, and their state capital had been subjected to airstrikes. So a lot of parents decided that they would move the children closer to the Thai border so that they could continue their studies and be in safety. And that camp is essentially run by 24-year-olds. We saw another alumni who was concerned about COVID, who raised funds to buy vaccines from the Thai health system for Chant IDPs. She didn't know how to administer the vaccines, so she convinced Thai medics to do so. When Thai medics say, hey, this is Myanmar, we can't go into a war zone and this is international, we can't cross the international boundary, she said, no worries. She brought them to the border, she set up a tent, she drew a line, said, this is the border, you stay on this Thai side, and the Chant IDPs queued up and just presented their arm across the line. Using this method over the space of several months, over 5,000 internally displaced persons from Chant state were triple vaxxed against COVID. And this type of strategy, this innovation is being done up and down the border by medics, including a lot of young people who are engaged in this work. So you can already start to see the solutions are happening. The question is whether we can support them to scale it up. Aviation fuel sanctions, I think I don't have to explain why. We've already seen the number of the rise in airstrikes and how they target civilians. Believe it or not, there is still no global arms embargo on this illegal junta. You would think that would be the most obvious thing to do, but the UN Security Council had the first resolution on Myanmar in history. This is the first time in Myanmar-Burma's history that there's been a UN Security Council resolution on them. But Russia and China vetoed the use of coercive measures to ensure that the junta dial down or reduce their violence. So still no global arms embargo. Of course, targeted economic sanctions, particularly to sources of revenue for the junta, is essential. Many countries and states around the world have applied targeted sanctions, but we still see the US, as I said, averse to any sanction involving oil or fuel, whether it's aviation fuel sanction or sanctioning the Myanmar oil and gas enterprise, one of the largest sources of revenue for junta, and increasing visibility. 2 weeks ago at the Frontiers of Prevention conference, I was personally very moved to see speakers from Ukraine saying, yes, our situation is bad, but there are many conflicts around the world suffering like us. Some people have no longer see Burma Myanmar on the news, and they assume that the situation has resolved itself. No, it has not. In fact, the illegal junta leader, Min Aung Hlaing, wishes to hold an election to justify or to legitimize his continued rule. And he's already changed the rules of the game, and as a result, the parties that won 88% of the seats in 2020 have been officially dissolved by the junta. So he's actually stacked the odds in his favor. The reality is that this election, because it's Min Aung Hlaing, this election actually has featured a rise in violence. The airstrikes, the increasing brutality, are efforts by the junta to gain control of pockets of territory around the country so they can hold an election and say, we have elections all around the country. The resistance is extremely concerned that the election will be used as an excuse by the international community to normalize the coup and normalize relations. And so they are fighting back even harder. So we already start to see that the violence is likely to increase. And that's why all of us should be raising the alarm, and also in our own way, whether it's in social media. All of you, I'm sure, have a social media account of some sort. Please share the news, please highlight it, and don't forget that your peers in Burma are fighting for the right to enjoy peace, no government getting in their way, and the ability to actually go back to school. So thank you. Any questions? I love questions. Yes.
Why do you think that after there's many movements where the younger people are involved, why do you think that there's such a surprise still today that they're behind some of the movements, even though they proved to be successful?
They're surprised. Why are people surprised that young people are successful?
Yeah.
In Burma, Myanmar, there's quite an interesting paradox. Historically, students were at the forefront of the struggle for independence from the British. At various times in the history, whether it was the ALTSEAN funeral riots, you know that there was a UN Secretary General from Burma in the 70s, and when he died, his funeral became the focus of protests by students. And in 88 uprising, the August 8, 1988 uprising was actually led by students. And now here we see the prominence of young people with more progressive ideals than the generation before them. There is that history, and some people there are people who are in their 50s will come and tell you, I'm a student. It's not that they enroll in a course, it means that's their political identity. So there's that piece. But then there's also this traditional discrimination against young people, that older people need to be respected, and you can't speak out against them, you can't contradict them. So there's this very interesting friction. And when crisis happens, then the young people come to the fore. And so this is both a social and political phenomenon, and a social and political paradox. But I'm not surprised that young people are doing this, because they have more to lose. You know, us oldies will die next generation, but they have to deal with this shit that's happening now. So they should have the right to protest and fight back, whether it's against the Burmese illegal coup, or whether it's to address climate change substantially. Yes?
What's the response been from Thailand as a neighbor, which has historically had a pretty porous border with Myanmar and north, and accepting and bringing in refugees, Korean especially? Have they met the moment, or has it been pretty bad?
Never in the history, never in recent history, and I'm talking about being involved in this movement for 30 years, that I've seen Thailand present such a barrier to civilian protection. And that's because the current Prime Minister Prior is in a bromance with Min Aung Hlaing. He's equally afraid that the pro-democracy movement from Burma will embolden the pro-democracy movement in Thailand, which is also led by young people. So this three-finger salute is absolutely scary to many governments in the region, including in Hong Kong and China. So yeah, we are hoping the situation will shift, because it's not in Thailand's interest to let this crisis continue. So this is something, previously Thailand had a more benign and more pragmatic approach to conflicts in Burma. They were more tolerant of what was going on, especially when it came to civilians. So we are really, really hoping that situation will change. So all eyes are on May 14th, the date of the Thai general election. But we're also a little bit concerned because the original date was May 7th, and it got moved to May 14th, which, surprise, happens to be final exams day for most students in the country in the university. So let's see what happens. One of the things is that looking at Burma, it could be stressful, but it's never boring. Something is always happening. Sometimes it's soul destroying and it's heartbreaking, but the thing is that something is always happening, and sometimes change and breakthrough comes when you least expect it, because you don't see that happening on the surface, but there's so many dynamics happening under the surface that actually lead to change. So we got to keep our energy up. Yes.
Thank you so much for being here. Something that one of the symbols of something that really stuck out to me very clearly, I don't know whether you should like that. So the music there with the building, you guys still like it, or in Burma, it's still like it's really cool environment. And it's really, it's motivating in the sense and inspiring to see the role that youths are playing, especially.
Sorry?
You
have said, yeah.
It's inspiring to see the role that youths are playing in Burma, and just kind of like reinforcing the power of our generation today. And I think in some sense that gives some focus to see like what things would look like in the future would be. So that's really
I think that's also why the human rights movements need to invest in intergenerational leadership. And I might be idealistic, but the youth leadership in Burma, Myanmar against this brutal regime, I see parallels of young people all around the world also fighting for what they believe in and fighting for their future. So sometimes people say, oh, let me finish the exams and I'll do something, or let me finish my degree, my postgraduate, and then I'll do something. The thing is that now is the time you should do something. You don't have to give up everything. There's so many things you can do from the comfort of your living room. So I hope at the very least it inspires you to understand that as young people, you have the power to make the change now, and you should use it.
What are some channels for getting information from Myanmar? Like Radio Free Asia is in the region. Are there other like websites and
There are
resources?
lots of different websites, and on Twitter hashtag what's happening in Myanmar, a lot of people from inside the country are posting. Progressive Voice is a Burmese-led advocacy group that puts out statements and highlights developments. My organization, ALTSEAN, summarizes up to 500 news articles a month and sorts them under 7 thematic trackers. And every month we produce a Coup Watch briefer that gives an overview of what's been happening on the country in that month. All you have to do is go to our website, www.altsean.org. I'm going to say this very slowly so you have a pen to write it down. ALTSEAN.org. And you just click the subscribe and we'll automatically send you a Coup Watch briefer every month. And if you wanted to write your own papers, your own briefers, particularly on women, on conflict and displacement, on international responses, economics, COVID, health and education, just download the tracker, the monthly tracker for that topic. And it's all sourced, so you'll be able to put something together relatively quickly. So we are your we're your sous chef. So, everything is neatly done, and you should be able to start making something out of those prepared ingredients. Anything else? Yes.
How do you think the
the civil society organizations, some of them predate the transitional period and were based on the border, and then they went back into the country and continued their work. And then when the coup happened, many of them started to set up offices in diaspora and with a staff and partners still on the ground doing the work. So there are CSOs who are working in a transboundary fashion to continue the work that they're doing. Some of the groups have moved from welfare work to humanitarian relief. Other groups that were involved in political advocacy went into humanitarian relief because of the urgency of the situation. But what we've also seen is the growth of emerging new organizations, mainly by urban youth in diaspora, and we are actually advocating to donors to be able to create a hub that can give out small grants to support these small emerging organizations for them to do their work. And once these groups become more established and more empowered, then there's a possibility for alliances to be formed. We don't want to push groups. We don't want to push force activists to form larger CSOs for the sake of convenience. We want to actually nurture these small emerging groups so that they can grow and connect to each other. So CSOs still play a vital role. Some of them have shifted their roles. Some of them have tried to spread risk, manage risk by having some people outside the country to be liaisons with international partners and while still on the ground quietly working in country. So it's still happening. In fact, there are probably more CSOs now because a lot of young people who were basically living their lives and going to college suddenly go, oh, okay, you better do something. Max and then
Could you talk a little bit more about how the ethnic resistance movements, which have been around for a long time now, how are they coordinating, or how well are they coordinating with the national unity government and with a lot of the newer resistance movements in SPARC, which I assume are now including a lot of Burma young people. I mean, do they want the same? I mean, they share the same enemy, but do they want the same thing?
this is actually quite an interesting question. On the fighting resistance front, a lot of the local militias that became People's Defense Forces (PDFs). Some of them actually got training and linked with ethnic resistance organizations. Sorry, let me read water. Okay, so they teamed up with ethnic resistance organizations who had more experience fighting the military and got training from them. Some of these groups were also trained by police and army personnel who defected, who didn't want to be engaged in these crimes and were demoralized, and they joined the resistance and they trained some of these militias. So what we're seeing, if you look at the cabinet lineup of the National Unity Government, it's actually got the highest proportion of different ethnic people in cabinet in the nation's history. And having said that, that's actually quite a good but the acting president is an ethnic Kachin. So this is a part of an ongoing trust building process. And what we're looking at is building trust after more than 6 decades of distrust and conflict. So it's moving ahead slowly, but there have been some common agreements, and that's why we feel optimistic about it. But that you still have to keep on working and calling people out in terms of their dominant mainstream privilege, sensitizing them to the situation of rural people and ethnic people, And doing that. Unfortunately, sometimes it's the Rohingya, it's the Chants, it's the Karen, the marginalized communities that have that extra burden of doing the outreach. Yeah, it's incredibly unfair, but I think there is a lot of energy and goodwill and commitment for traditionally marginalized people to make sure that the majority Burmans hear them and learn how to work with them. It's not about ethnics learning how to work with the dominant. It's about teaching the dominant group how to work with the ethnics, how to be sensitized. So some of these PDFs are operating without a chain of command. And the ethnic resistance organizations, the armed groups, have actually had more experience fighting. They have a better chain of command and better discipline. So these are some of the tensions which are coming up. I mean, we're looking at 2.5 years, 2.25 years down the track, trying to address a legacy of 50 or 60 years.
I was going to ask how you stay optimistic and hopeful when conflict or issues that you're dealing with seem, I guess, kind of like hopeless at times. Like, where you get your inspiration from to keep working?
Hopeless is not in my dictionary. I've been very lucky. I'm an oldie. I've been doing this. I've been an activist, a human rights activist since 1986. So it's been a while. And what I learned is that when these kinds of bodies are increasingly brutal, it means they're panicking, they're afraid. In fact, I would argue in many repressive countries in the world, the biggest threat to national security is young people. That in the view of oppressive governments. So in the midst of all of these things that are happening, we're seeing change. We're seeing different viewpoints, more progressive views, more inclusive views coming to the front. We're seeing innovation. And, when a dictator or brutal dictatorship is coming after you, they want you to be miserable and fearful. So finding joy and humor and remaining resilient is an important form of resistance. When your friends and your colleagues are feeling down, there's something you can do to try and support them. Because we can't afford to give up. And believe it or not, it's a matter of time. We are on the winning side. We're not on the losing side.
I just think, I think that was a great question for you to ask, and from my perspective of looking at lots and lots of these conflicts, or like David's looks at a lot of these conflicts, firing rockets into villages filled with civilians from attack helicopters is a sign of weakness, not strength. It's the sort of thing that scares off your existing or potential allies. It signals that you're not in control of the situation. And I think that Burma is one of these situations where the good guys will win. I mean, I really do. That the junta is looking quite weak and quite scared.
Yes, I agree with that, and it's simply a case of whether states, whether governments in the international community are actually going to boost their game and support the winning side. That's one thing. One of the other things that we need to recognize is that many of us in the movement have had friends die from torture, friends in jail, friends assassinated in very terrible ways. And it is always a shock and it's always a source of grief. But if that person, and I think what Aku, one of our friends who was killed by a sniper at a protest, she was the director of Women for Justice in Saga and the rest of the country. She was assassinated weeks after the coup. for many people, they were trying to encourage her and push her to leave. And she said, I'm already under watch. If I move, then other people around me could be hurt. And she was assassinated. And I think, you would have a conversation, I would have a conversation with people in my mind and say, I'm so pissed. But she's not going to say, fall down the heap and be hopeless. She's going to say, keep on working. So, all our friends who have fallen, I think about them, and I think, what would they like us to do? Of course, we basically have to do a little bit extra on their behalf. So I think this is something that we have that. It's good to have that understanding and that attitude. Of course, there will be moments when we grieve. There will be moments where we feel so angry and upset, and it is natural and human to have that. But I also think that I'm incredibly privileged because I still am in a position to be able to do something. And that is something that we need to remember. The other side wants us to feel hopeless and helpless. And our resistance is to find joy and keep up the work. Yes.
So something I wanted to follow up on a question that was brought up earlier about resources online. So in other conflicts, we see sort of modern tyrannical practices in order to suppress younger people is to tap internet access, social media access, or to shut it down entirely. Northern Blue, they will have the WhatsApp group, so they'll try and just make these infrastructures simply unreliable. Has that been an issue? And what the perspective has been? We see that it's pretty resilient outcome regardless, but I was just interested in seeing
Burma, Myanmar had the longest internet shutdown in the world in Rakhine State prior to during the COVID pandemic and also after the coup. The military started shutting down the internet for 12 hours a day, and that basically messed up the banking system. 75% of retail banks closed. What has happened is that in some places, internet access is still a problem, still a challenge. Access to electricity is still a challenge because people started boycotting paying the electricity bills because they didn't want to give money to the military junta. But still people continued some way to find ways to communicate with each other. Now, digital money, digital wallets using phone data is still very important, and so in many cases, they still have to allow internet access to allow some of the economy to keep on running. Yeah, but people have also started using very early on in the coup, they started using VPNs. In rural areas, there have been some really amazing things. My colleagues are actually running an online course for young women from different ethnic groups in Burma. And they come online for up to 4 hours a day of class and discussion and project work. Now, sometimes you'll get a message saying, sorry, I can only come for half class today because it's been raining and there's not enough solar power for my phone. Another time I was in a webinar and I saw the name of a friend that I hadn't seen for months and I'd been worried about her. So I said, hey, Susu, is that really you? And she said, yes. And she turned on her camera. And there was this ghostly round face and total darkness behind her. Her face was lit up by her phone. And I said, Susu, where the hell are you? And she said, I'm in the jungle near the Thai border. I'm using Thai signal. And I've been charging my phone in solar power whole day so I can join this webinar and see you. So, that motivation to connect. I have another alumni, and I see her Facebook page. Sometimes every few months she posts on Facebook. She's usually up in a tree doing a selfie and you're saying, "This is the only way I can get signal." So so we kind of we just see like, oh, these guys are wild. Especially these young people and women, they're just so wild. They just do all these things, and they're working with fear and death and destruction and tragedy. They're trying to support the communities, and they still can joke about having to climb a tree to get enough signal. So when you have people around you, like in your network like that, and people like that doing crazy shit like that, you just think like, I'm just exploring old lady in Bangkok taking away at my computer. And like I feel so safe, and I feel so like, and people say, "Oh, what are you doing?" That it's like the meme, like what my friends think I do, what my family thinks I do, and what I really do. So what my friends think I do is like I'm on the street going, ah, and what the Vietnamese and other governments think I do look like I'm doing some kind of James Bond thing. But really what I'm doing is I'm just Jabba the Hutt and my laptop. Or maybe getting on a plane and coming to Binghamton. Yes.
What's the Biden administration's official policy towards Burma now and the hood that revolution?
I would like to flip that question to someone who has closer contact with the administration.
Oh my god. Singer. I guess the Biden administration. So let's talk about U.S. Policies in general.
Come up here, Wei.
I
Come
guess
on.
it's okay.
Tell us about your ties first, so we can process.
I'm an activist, exiled for being badass, and I guess basically number one unwanted in Burma. So I
No,
have to
she's
be-
wanted by all the wrong guys.
Yeah. So I've been exiled, now officially, but technically exiled since 2018. A lot of we still have a lot of work back in Burma, and I also focus a lot on international advocacy. I have done a lot of work with Debbie at the UN, in Geneva and New York in terms of advocacy. But lately, since I'm based in DMV area, DC metropolitan area, I've been engaging with the U.S. government much more closely than before. Before 2021, by both administration, the Trump administration and Obama administration, they were extremely difficult to. They were extremely reluctant to take any actions against the Burmese military for the crimes that they were committed in the past against the Rohingya and other ethnic communities. But after 2021, they become a bit more open to responding to the crisis. I guess they came to realize their policy before, their pro-engagement policy with the Burma as a country was a mistake. And now that they're trying to fix a little bit, but there is not enough political interest or political willingness to take the Burma issue in a more comprehensive response or comprehensive manner, the way that they responded to the Ukraine. Although the tragedy or the tactics that military has been using is not identical in nature, but a lot of similarity and a lot of tragedies has been, similar tragedies has been ongoing, but there is not enough political leadership from the US government. They have actually increased a lot of the targeted economic sanctions and SDN list, like targeting individuals as well as the companies, but they haven't actually touched on the major industry that create revenue for the military, which is Myanmar oil and gas enterprise. So Debbie mentioned in her presentation. So that's one of the major calls from the revolutions from all of us for the U.S. government to take action. So oil and gas industry and aviation fuel. So that is something that they can do as a state unilaterally, or multilaterally in coordination with other US partners and allies, but they haven't done it yet. But there are other things that they can actually take a bit more a leadership role in the UN, but they haven't pushed enough that the way that it's supposed to be. It's like even in the case of the very historical resolution that we were able to get last year, December, it was extremely soft. US government didn't put enough like push in the UN dialogue and discussion when negotiation happened within among the countries. US government didn't take enough leadership. It was UK pushed a little bit harder. So we're trying too much in terms of pushing them to really take actions. Last year, Congress passed a law that is under the National Defense Authorization Act and the NDAA. The law is called Burma Act, so it has a huge sections on Burma. So that authorized U.S. government to do certain things in terms of political pressure, economic pressure, and accountability, as well as supporting the revolution as a whole, national unity government, national unity consultative councils, and other actors involved, including the People Defense Forces, Arms Resistance Movement, in non-legal assistance, not actually legal. So, but still there are a lot that U.S. government can actually take this Burma Act and to put a bit more emphasis and a bit more support to the Burma, but we still need a lot of stronger push against the U.S. government to really take action the way they can. And this year we're actually focusing on allocating budget for this Burma Act so that the U.S. government can implement all the section that's included under the Burma Act. And in the Burma Act, quite interestingly, the act was introduced in 2017, and it has a major component of addressing genocide against the Rohingya. But in final version of it, the entire sections of the Rohingya accountability was removed. So now that my organization is leading actually to introduce a Rohingya standalone bill. So we are actually drafting the process, the draft, and so we're gonna, along with other NGOs, a few other like-minded or partner NGOs in DC, we are going to introduce that with a few congressional officers, and a few of them already agreed. Hopefully this year we'll get the Rohingya Genocide Act, and so in combine all of this legislation, hopefully U.S. government will take stronger action. So we need your support. So thank you.
So basically, please tell President Biden and Secretary Blinken, stop wimping out on Burma. It's done a certain amount of good so far, but it can do so much more.
Yeah.
And I think that's needed. For us, we have a sense of urgency because our young friends, many young friends, have joined the armed resistance. At some stage, we want them to have the ability to go back to college, to go back to school. But if someone has become an armed guerrilla or armed resistance for many years, the longer you are fighting, the harder it is to go back to civilian life in which political solutions are the solutions that you need. So we don't want to lose a generation of young people to war. And that's the sense of urgency that we have, Wei and me and all our colleagues in the movement, that we need all hands on deck to make sure that this victory is not at the expense of an entire generation of young people. So, yes, Dave.
So this is a terrible situation, and I thank you for telling us so much about it. I wish I had known more about it before. But I wonder about ordinary soldiers who are apparently supporting this spook level. Do you think that their support is monolithic? Don't they have a lot in common with the young people that they're addressing?
That's why we've actually seen quite a high number of defectors. Firstly, many people join the military traditionally not because they want to kill people. It's because of the economic opportunities and benefits of being in the army. The army actually owns and runs major businesses in the country. And so they joined for economic security. And now they're in a situation where people are actually trying to kill them and shooting back. Previously, when they attacked ethnic villages, all they had to worry about was ethnic armed organizations fighting back. But here, they're actually killing people from their own ethnic background and their own religion in their own homes, in their own areas. And so a lot of police and military balked at this after some time and defected. There's actually an organization called People's Embrace. It evokes like civilians going, come on, police, army, you know you want to hug, come over here. But actually, People's Embrace is aimed at encouraging fighters from the junta to defect. What the military has done in retaliation is forced the wives and children of the military to undergo military training and to do military duty, like guard duty or sentry duty. The Air Force pilots' families are sequestered. In a way, the military is actually holding family members hostage to ensure that there are no more defections. Even in the junta, what we're hearing is that the who are considered potentially moderate members of the junta are being watched by hardline members of the junta to prevent any purge or any kind of dissent from emerging within the junta. So everyone's trying to keep a tight control, but at some stage, this is a very brittle junta, and things start to crack. So people there's actually quite a large number of military people who have defected, and the more senior military families are extremely unhappy. Some military families have even done anonymous protest photos on social media and Facebook to show that they hate what's going on. So they understand that because of this coup, the violence and the ongoing economic chaos, they are actually losing all the economic opportunities that they signed up for. And the person who's making a lot of money is Min Aung Hlaing, the general, and his family members. So there are cracks, and the military is actually having a difficult time trying to recruit new soldiers. They're actually going to the jails to recruit criminals, saying you'll be let out if you join the military. They're actually recalling retired members of the military back to duty.
Could I ask a question? Oh, no, go ahead, please.
I was going to ask what's going on with the
situation? The Rohingya actually have become more threatened. Rohingya in the country who try to leave their places to get to safety are being arrested for violating immigration law because they're subjected to weird immigration laws that make it illegal for Rohingya to travel from one part of the state to another state or even to another part of the country. So we've had several hundred people arrested and detained for 2 years, including a 2-year-old child, for trying to move. The Rohingya who are in Cox's Bazar camp are facing violence, they're facing a lack of rule of law, and now they're facing the threat of being forced back to Burma under this military because the Bangladesh government is tired of hosting them. So Rohingya refugees in other parts of Asia, including in Malaysia, are being criminalized. In Malaysia, some Rohingyas have been detained without charge for more than 2 years, which is actually technically against Malaysian law. And earlier last year when some of them tried to flee, they broke out and tried to flee. They were killed by traffic at 4 a.m. And so we have a huge criminalization of Rohingya in Malaysia, when actually the demand should be, hey, these guys have survived a genocide. Can you not prolong the impact of genocide by persecuting them even further? Last year, the number of Rohingya and other people trying to flee by sea from both Bangladesh and Rakhine State rose by several 100%. And there were thousands of people trying to flee by sea, and a lot of them went missing or died at sea. So last year was the deadliest year for Rohingya trying to flee Bangladesh and Burma by sea. Because the knowledge that you might be forced back under military dictatorship is quite frightening, but also the understanding that the prospect of a safe return is very unlikely the longer the military junta works. And so this hope of being able to go home safely is undermined. And so people think, okay, then we need to leave and find another place that's safe. So instead of staying in Bangladesh. So we're seeing Rohingya being pushed and persecuted still on all fronts. And that's why it's really important to have a Rohingya Act in US legislation. So this is something that's quite important. I think Rohingya movement realizes that their safety and liberation really depends on the success of the movement in overturning the coup, and that's why Rohingya actively also engaged in this movement. Like we were doing 5-hour Zooms.
Too late, or should I still have? So, Debbie, I just can't wrap my arms around the idea that you said the CSO sector has grown.
Sorry?
You said the CSO sector has grown since the coup. What does that look like? Is the work clandestine? Is it done in areas where the government doesn't have control? Because I imagine, that the government wouldn't support the emergence of CSOs. So what does it look like? Are they all sort of advocacy organizations?
No, a lot of them are involved in providing humanitarian aid, health support, education support, human rights documentation. So we're saying, when I say the sector is growing, it's like there are many more organizations coming up. People who didn't think about doing that work before, seeing the necessity and urgency of doing it. Some of them are also independent media and citizen journalists as well.
And the government, how does the government see them? Do they see them as
There's the NUG, National Unity Government, and there's the illegal junta.
Yeah. How does the illegal junta sort of see them?
See them as a threat.
Right. Yeah.
So the illegal junta sees this as a threat, and they're trying to force UN agencies and NGOs to sign MOUs with them, to obey them and go where they're told to go. Whereas a number of organizations, locally based organizations that actually face more risk and have fewer resources, are working in a clandestine manner. And this is the example was the response to COVID. Even before the coup, there were two national committees addressing COVID. One was a civilian committee made up of government representatives, including Aung San Suu Kyi and the health department. And the other one was an army committee that didn't have anyone from health. And they actually had a securitized response by breaking down and burning down ethnic health checkpoints, saying this doesn't have the approval of the military government, so we're destroying it. When local people tried to help their own communities and protect their own communities from COVID. So what happened with the COVID response was that different groups then tried to find access to vaccines without using the public health system, the health workers who joined the civil disobedience movement were being targeted, they were being killed because they considered public enemy number one by the junta. So they went underground and they started to train more medics and started to do their work underground. So some of these groups have just emerged and they're doing their work, and we will never know until much later how many new CSOs they actually are. But they are there. Some of them are actually working with the NUG, the National Unity Government, or movement for the border movement and aligning with the border movement. So this is something that's quite interesting. And you can see also, traditionally, before the coup, if a village in, say, Karen State was attacked, and the villagers flee, the first thing they do is set up the school, whether it's a kid sitting on a log and then they bring out the books. So, you know, when the military comes into their area, there's a military attack, the kids have to carry their school books and a bottle of water in their backpack. That's part of their escape plan so that they can continue their studies. And the IDP camp of 400 teenagers being put near the border in order to learn, to keep on trying to maintain access to education, is not just an isolated example. There are many cases like that throughout the country. So, yeah, they find ways and means to survive. Sometimes people are able to give them small grants, but you know, sometimes large governments who have the means to support these efforts say, oh, they balk at the fact that, oh, there's no receipts, how are you going to report? And we're like, excuse me, this is war. Can you just like handle some photos? Or even better, some INGOs even say, okay, we'll give you the money, but you've got to put our logo on the bags. And it's like, do you want to make the kids a target? So, I think some of the CSOs are being less polite now. They're saying, excuse me, this is a war zone. If you're going to give us the money for us to do our work, we have to understand our context. And many of them are new groups, and many of them are old groups who went dormant during the transition period and then were reactivated because of